Hello there, everyone. Today we're going to talk about when to retreat from fights and also when to abandon from dungeons. We'll start with when you should retreat from fights because naturally you're going to take way more fights than you are going to go into dungeons because you're probably going to take on average, depending on the size of your dungeon, 4 to 7 fights per dungeon. And obviously you're only going to be doing that once per dungeon. So you're going to have way more opportunities to retreat than you are going to have to abandon. Now, pretty much 2 scenarios where retreating is absolutely the best thing. First one, it's clear and cut and should be obvious to save heroes. Now, retreating is not 100%, it's actually 70% plus 5% every attempt after that. With that information in mind, try to have about maybe 2 heroes to try to escape. Because let's say you do see someone on death's door and you're like, you know what, maybe I could stress heal here for like a little bit of like greed and then back out. Don't bother. You're already going to take so much stress damage backing out. Unless that person's going to get a heart attack, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Make sure that you can get them out alive with multiple retreat chances. If you maybe have a stun and one enemy has a turn left to go, maybe you can stun, try to get 2 turns that way, just so maybe you don't get out luckied by the speed mechanic. But for the most part, just always mash the retreat button first to save someone. As you play the game more though, you will start to foresee potential deaths a lot better and you can actually back out before they die. In a situation like this is, let's say you have a leper in the front and you have a Vestal. And your leper will go to death's door on the bleed tick. You're like, okay, not a problem. Because I can either heal with the Vestal, get him enough HP, or once it's the leper turn, I can self-heal, right? There's a lot of ways to technically keep that leper alive. Now, on the weird off chance, let's say he has like 2 HP. Let's say the enemy comp has a Fusilier. And now, once they fire, they put your leper onto death's door. Well, now that bleed tick has a chance to kill. And in a scenario where your leper gets to go first, they just got a higher speed roll, and that bleed tick kills them, you may feel like a moron for not retreating with the first couple of turns. Because you could have foreseen you like, you know what, on the worst RNG ends, I could lose somebody. And this is why we're going to talk about calculated risks after this segment, because sometimes it's worth having that risk in your personal opinion. To get the subjective out of the way, some people absolutely believe you should never lose anyone in Darkest Dungeon. They believe any time someone goes to death's door or you foresee a death's door, you should just retreat, because losing people is the end of the game. I personally am not one of those individuals, and I'm not saying that's a bad way to play. It is ironclad, you won't lose anyone, dungeons will be very safe, and in the end, maybe you'll save some time because you don't have to, like, especially at the higher levels, if you're more cautious at higher levels, it'll definitely save you time. But let's just talk about the early game. I still lose people in the early game a lot because I push those people to their absolute limits. I don't mind a couple of death's door checks, I don't mind losing people if I'm not playing, obviously, on the hardest difficulty. Because it doesn't really negatively affect me too much depending on how far you are in the dungeon, because at the end of the day you're going to dismiss them. Now, as soon as I hit veteran, that mindset changes. That's when I go, okay, no one dies, and that's when I start taking the much more potentials to retreat, where I start really keeping people healed and stuff, and I don't recklessly throw people into dungeons 2 to 3 times in a row. That being said, you have to kind of address how your playstyle is. If you absolutely despise losing people, play the first way, ironclad, foresee how turns go, understand the mechanics of speed, understand the DOT, the death's door mechanics, start getting percentages. If you have a 35% chance to die, and if I take that 2 turns in a row, you know, like, what is my percentage of one of those death doors taking me out, right? Let's say you have a 70% chance death blow resistance. So get it once is 7 out of 10. To get it twice is 49 out of 100 or 49%. So I have pretty much a 50-50 shot of losing that hero if they take 2 death door turns. And you just have to ask yourself, are you feeling lucky that day? And if you are, go for it. If not, back out. Now, to get on to the second point of retreating and when you might do it, this is what I call situational retreating. And this is mostly for bosses and room conditions. And what I mean by that is, I haven't ever done it, but I believe once you explore the last room you need to and explore the room option, it will tick. Now, sometimes that doesn't tick over until you finish your fight in a room. But it might be possible if your party's a little bit in shambles and you know you can't take another fight, but you also know you're 1 room away from completing the dungeon. I believe if you go in, discover the room, and then back out, you're good. The second one is mostly for maybe like party setups or mostly a Brigand Pounder setup. I'm not going to talk about the boss too much because I don't really want to spoil. But obviously, if you know who the Brigand Pounder is or what the Brigand Pounder is, you can understand there's a certain setup where if you don't get a good cases of RNG and you foresee yourself not being able to deal with the situation you have to, you can actually back out before you put everyone into harm's way, essentially. So without disclosing too much, if you know the boss, you could foresee why actually retreating, taking that stress damage, is still a better gain rather than the potential of what could happen to your party if you decide to stay in there and just tough it out. The real question we have to ask though is, when should we abandon a dungeon? Because that's really the bigger loss in my personal opinion. Sometimes you gotta abandon dungeons very quickly. You literally get through a fight or two and you've already had multiple individuals on death's door. You don't have strong heals, but let's just say you got super unfortunate with a couple of crits right in a row on one person, and you just really can't get their HP above like 8 or 10. You got another like 5 fights to go. At that point you might be like, you know what? They're champion level. These fights are super hard. I don't have great heals left. I just gotta back out. It sucks, but the amount of quirks and stress damage you're going to take will be a shorter amount of time than it will be to raise up a new Resolve 6, essentially. Best case scenario, level 4 Radiant, you get the exact same class you want, but you still get a whole bunch of negative quirks, and you still got to bring them up from Resolve 4, so it's not even necessarily still better. That's just best case scenario. And that's where we talk about, once again, keeping people alive rather than losing them, just because of the sheer amount of time it takes to get from Resolves 3 and 4 to Resolve 6 and in good condition. To me, honestly though, abandoning dungeons should be looked at as a last resort. Let's say you've taken some like really hard fights and stuff, but the dungeon itself is not very linear and you have other paths you can explore. I'm always a fan and a component of exploring other paths first to see if there's an easier way to do the same objective. For example, if you are doing like a collect curios mission or explore the room mission, let's say you just got rocked, but you scout and you see that, oh, I need to explore 4 more rooms and I know 3 of these only have 1 fight. Okay, you know what? Even though I'm not feeling too well, I can at least start maybe scouting and foresee. So I wouldn't like pull the trigger on abandoning quickly, because abandoning does a couple of things that's really brutal to your party. Obviously, you lose out on the money, which hurts, and you lose out on the resolve, which can hurt, but in champion level doesn't really matter, obviously, unless you have 5s, then you go to 6s, and even at that point, resolve 5, resolve 6 isn't a huge power spike anyway, so it still might be worth it just to back out. But as I said, when you decide to abandon dungeons, typically it's when you have either 3 to 4 afflictions and your party literally cannot function. You might actually have a decent party, you might even have a decent amount of HP, but at the end of the day, it only takes a couple of weird affliction turns or a turn skip for someone to drop in a fight and for you to do nothing. Because you might be thinking, oh, you know what, I'm just going to back out if the fight goes poorly. Yeah, that's a cute idea until you fail a retreat option and then your last person skips and then you lose a hero. There's a couple of things you want to ask yourself before you abandon. First, you got to say the amount of the dungeon or length left. Like, am I 80-90% through this dungeon and do I just have to take 1 more battle room to get out? It might be worth finishing. Or did I just start, get critted by a giant, I now have 0 HP, I have like 8 HP left, which is, you know, like practically nothing in champion level. I need to get out now, just take this as a minute. Second is, how do you heal or stress heal? If you're going in the Cove where it's much more stress heavy than damage heavy and you don't have a good natural stress healer, you have to ask yourself, at what point am I willing to get 4 afflictions and make this hurt more than just hitting the abandon button? Because I might get 4 afflictions, still lose, because once you get to 3 or 4 afflictions, it's very difficult to finish the dungeon because people start taking their own turns, they start skipping turns, they start hurting themselves. Finally, kind of the same idea. How am I going to keep people alive? Like, how do I heal? Is it just food? Do I have a campfire? Can it reverse some of this damage? If not, you might just have to abandon at the end of the day. And if you abandon early enough, in all honesty, those people are pretty much ready to go back out the next week. So you just kind of do a do-over if it's in the very beginning. The mechanics themselves are fairly dry. However, the philosophy and mindsets behind retreating and abandoning dungeons can, weirdly enough, be a sore spot among some players. As I said in the beginning, some people absolutely believe you should not, cannot, no reason to lose somebody. I'm a little looser on that and I get flack for it. I lose people all the time the first 15 to 20 weeks, and I honestly don't care. People say, well, it makes your dungeon harder in the middle of the dungeon. Yeah, it does, but it's like resolve zeros. For the most part, the enemies are so weak, you can even 3-man a lot of the dungeons. Like, I take antiquarians into resolve 0 dungeons. I'm pretty much 3v4ing already, and we get out just fine. That's my philosophy. If you can't handle losing people, I think I already said it, please go back to the very first one where you take absolute every step, you foresee potential deaths, and you back out. Because at the end of the day, you have to accept and like what you're doing. If being super safe isn't your strategy and you find yourself like stressing on when you should retreat or not, you might just have to play aggressive until you realize the extent of your aggressiveness. And there's going to be a lot of failures with that, because trust me, I had to take a lot of failures before I learned the limits of the aggression you can take in this game. For the most part, 99.9% of the time, you probably get a chance to retreat before someone dies. Thank you for watching.